On December 20th, 2013, a 30-year-old PR executive named Justine Sacco was working through a layover at Heathrow, tweeting small, sour jokes about international travel to her 170 followers. Before boarding an 11-hour flight to Cape Town, she posted one more. Going to Africa. Hope I don't get AIDS. Just kidding. I'm white. Then she turned off her phone, and for 11 hours she did not exist. What she meant, she later told John Ronson on the record, and Ronson's reporting supports this account. It was a joke about the bubble, mocking the obliviousness of privileged Americans from inside the character of one. What the internet read was the character minus the quotation marks. A Gawker editor with a big following amplified it. And while she slept over the Atlantic, the machine we built this season out of sordid tribes, unanimous rooms, and attention economics found its perfect toy. A villain who could not respond. On a timer everyone could watch. The hashtag was hashtag has Justine landed yet? And by the time her plane began its descent, it was the #1 trend in the world. Strangers tracked her flight. A man went to the Cape Town airport to photograph her arrival and got the shot. A woman turning on her phone. She was fired, of course. Her employer had condemned the tweet before she landed. 170 followers when she took off. The most famous woman on the internet when the wheels touched down. Now, here's why this episode exists, and it isn't her story. You already know her story. It's famous. The story nobody tells is the other side of the ledger. Roughly 100,000 tweets, retweets, quips, pile-on jokes. Each one a flick of a thumb, most of whose authors would go on to remember her tweet forever and their own contribution not at all. That's the accurate version of the story. One bad joke and a pile-on measured at roughly 100,000 tweets, costing each participant almost nothing. You remember her tweet? Do you remember your retweet? To understand what those thumbs were doing, rewind 4 years. Early social media was, and people forget this, nice. John Ronson, who wrote the book on what came next, described early Twitter as a place of radical de-shaming. People confessed embarrassing things and strangers said me too. Then, around 2009 and 2010, the platforms installed or normalized the buttons, like share, retweet, and began making engagement visible, countable, and rankable. Facebook was already sorting feeds. Twitter's main ranked timeline came later, but the direction of travel was clear. Social expression was becoming a scored game. Innocent little buttons. But you've had 8 episodes of this season, so watch what the scoreboards actually did. They turned expression into a game, and the primitive mind, which has kept score of status since the savannah, sat down at the table and never got up. And one winning strategy, as a sizable body of research has since confirmed, is an insight, and it is in joy. It's strong emotion, moral anger above all, and tribal anger above that. The machine from episode 6, the one that discovered war rates better than governance, this is the same discovery, miniaturized, installed in every pocket, and paying out in hearts and followers 100 times a day. The cudgel from episode 4, the ancient technology of shame, the one liberal society spent 2 centuries caging, had just been industrialized, gamified, and handed back to everyone. And here's the half of this story that has to stay true, or the episode curdles into a lecture. The megaphone worked. For as long as power has existed, there's been a glitch in the liberal games. The abusive boss, the predatory doctor, the untouchable local tyrant, protected not by law, but by the fact that accusing them cost everything and accomplished nothing. Social media patched the glitch. A voiceless employee could suddenly tell her story past every gatekeeper, rally strangers, move advertisers, topple a man no institution would touch. Ronson called it the democratization of justice, and in its best moments, that's what it was. Some of the people the internet has shamed had it coming in ways courts never delivered. The problem was never that the cudgel can't land on the guilty. The problem is that it has no aim mechanism. No definition of the crime, no proportionality, no defense, no appeal, and thanks to search engines, no statute of limitations. It's a justice system with exactly one verdict and one sentence, administered by whoever is angriest, soonest, in the largest numbers. Sometimes that lands on a predator. Sometimes it lands on a woman asleep on a plane. The machine cannot tell the difference because nothing in it is built to ask. When the cudgel is used deliberately, and it is every day by movements of every color, Urban maps the process in 3 steps. And once you see them, you can't unsee them. Step 1. Find a villain, and if the offense is too small, resize it. Stretch a damning label until it fits. Clip the quote, skip the context. The master rule, and it's ancient, is guilty because accused. Margaret Atwood, who has watched revolutions eat their own in more than one century's fiction, points out that this move kicks in during the terror and virtue phase of every purge and adds the sentence that makes it the seasons. The list is long, and left and right have both indulged. Step 2. Destroy. One account fires. A bigger account amplifies. The algorithm, which measures activity and not truth, cranks the volume. The news engine writes it up because it's trending. The write-ups trend. And then the part nobody budgets for, the search engine, which optimizes for relevance and never forgets, quietly binds the whole storm to the person's name, so that the worst week of their life becomes permanently the first thing anyone learns about them. A writer using the name Barrett Wilson, confessing his own years as a shamer, explained the fuel from the inside. Every accusation he threw got a rush of hearts and stars, and he added, the people applauding were playing their own game. Because a fear of being targeted by the mob induces us to signal publicly that we are part of it. Read that twice. The mob is held together by fear of the mob. Step 3, make them radioactive. Guilt by association, defend the target, employ the target, even suggest the punishment has gone too far, and you're next. This is what turns a shaming into a quarantine. The point isn't just to punish one person. It's to make them expensive to stand near, so that even the people who privately think the mob is wrong will do what the Evergreen faculty did, what the King's Guards did, what you and I have done. The math, the silence. But the real product of a public shaming was never the shaming. Episode 3 taught you a room runs on outer selves. Episode 8 showed you a campus learning offense from one man's example. Now scale it. Every pile-on has 3 casts: the target, the participants, and the audience, which is everybody else, watching and learning the tariff schedule. The learning shows up in the data. In 2020, a national survey found 62% of Americans saying the political climate prevents them from saying things they believe. A majority of Democrats, a majority of independents, a larger majority of Republicans. Nearly every political group, in fact, except strong liberals, using the survey's own category and rising across the board. By 2022, a New York Times Commission poll found 84% of Americans calling this fear a serious national problem, and more than half saying that in the past year they personally had held their tongue. Sit with what those numbers describe. A country with some of the strongest speech protections ever written, where most citizens on every side report being afraid to say what they think. King Mustache never passed a law here. He didn't need one. The executions are televised. They're searchable. And the soft cudgel has exactly one weakness. It only works if everyone keeps letting it, which is why every silent watcher isn't just a victim of the fear. Or its power supply. So, the audit. And this week I did it literally. I scrolled my own history until I found one. A pile-on I joined years ago. One retweet plus a joke of my own, aimed at a stranger whose offense I could not accurately describe to you today. I can still remember faintly how it felt, which is the damning part, because what it felt like was justice, and what it cost me was nothing. And Ronson has the phrase for the arithmetic I helped perform. A disconnect between the severity of the crime and the gleeful savagery of the punishment. Here's the coda to the famous story, The part almost nobody knows because mobs don't do follow-ups. Justine Sacco rebuilt. Years later, she was rehired into the same corporate family that fired her, eventually running communications for one of its biggest companies. The internet that knew her name for a week never learned the ending because the machine has no mechanism for endings, only beginnings. Her worst joke is still the first thing her name retrieves. Somewhere in a data center, my little contribution to someone's worst week is still retrievable too. So is yours. The cudgel in your pocket has no safety, no memory of its own swings, and no owner. That last part was supposed to be the good news. 9 episodes, 1 toolkit, rungs, runes, golems, spirals, cudgels. You can see them everywhere now, in the news, in your feeds, in the people around you. And that sentence I just said should worry you because there's one place the toolkit points last, and it isn't at the people around you. Next time, the finale. What happens when a framework for diagnosing low-rung thinking becomes the most satisfying weapon a low-rung thinker ever held? And the question the whole season has been walking you toward while you were sorting everyone onto the ladder, ... Which rung were you standing on?